Right. So first of all, as Jane already did, I would like to mention my co-author, Irene Costera Meijer, who unfortunately could not be here. I work with Irene at the Free University of Amsterdam, but actually I'm from Belgium, which is an even smaller country than the Netherlands, and in which 3 languages are spoken, but none of them is English. So sorry for all the language mistakes I will make. You can count them if you like. And Belgium is known for
beer.
Beer, yes, chocolate. Okay.
French fries.
Actually, I expected no answer. And I would say yes, Belgium is known for nothing. Expect maybe for beer, chocolate, and also for the popularity of cycling races. And here we have a link with Austin, because the first time I've ever heard of a place called Austin was when I was a 12-year-old boy in my hometown Ghent, and it was the start of a local race. And on the start podium, they presented an American rider. And they said he was from Austin, Texas. And it was, of course, Lance Armstrong. And this was long before he recovered from cancer to win the Tour de France 7 times in a row, and long before the truth came out about all these victories. But back then, Lance Armstrong was already a story in Belgium, probably earlier in Belgium than in the States, because Belgium is very cycling mad. He was already a story back then in Belgium because he was very young, extremely young for a professional rider, because he only recently changed triathlon for cycling, because he had grown up without a father, because of his style, his presence. So he was already a story. And it was about that time that I decided that I want to write such stories myself, that I want to become a sports journalist. And to prepare for that career as a teenager, because I was about 12 years old, I started to write race reports, the reports of cycling races. But the funny thing about that was that I did not write those reports after the race was finished, but I wrote those reports before the races were held. Thus, actually what I did was I wrote a scenario of what I thought or hoped the race would, of how I thought or hoped the race would unfold. For instance, in 1999, I wrote a scenario in which Lance Armstrong recovered from cancer to win the Tour de France, which was back then a very unrealistic scenario, because he recovered from cancer and he was not a specialist in that kind of races. But we all know what happened. Maybe he won that Tour de France, and it's about that. So actually, my scenario became reality. And that is the mechanism I want to talk about with you today, that journalisms make scenarios, or at least story angles, and that journalists sometimes find the story they are looking for. Because what happened, I went to university, and then I became indeed a cycling journalist, but a few years ago I changed journalism for academia. And for my PhD, I interviewed journalists about the development of their news stories. So I reconstructed actually their stories. For my postdoc, what I'm doing now in Amsterdam, I do more or less the same, interviewing journalists, but another type of journalists. Actually, the journalists I interviewed could be categorized in 2 groups. For my PhD, I interviewed this kind of journalist, the newsmaker, That's a journalist who works on daily stories, a journalist at a prototypical newsmaker works for a certain news beat, domestic affairs or economy, and he works on daily stories. He seldom leaves the news desk. He is calling the whole day, he's very active on social media, and he presents his stories in a rather conventional, traditional way, using the inverted pyramid style, for instance. So that was the first category of journalists, you could say. And now for my postdoc, I'm interviewing another kind of journalists. You could call them the storytellers. These journalists are not specialized in a certain topic. They could write about politics, about sport, about whatever, you name it. But for them, it was the style, the form was more important than the topic. These journalists, they, well, for them, they don't like to be in a newsroom. They want to go out because they want to go to be in the field, because that is where stories, good stories, are found. In presenting their stories, these journalists, these storytellers, they challenge actually all things that are defended by the newsmakers. So they don't like the inverted pyramids. They like to experiment with different storytelling, different ways of storytelling, such as narrative styles, such as some of them with virtual reality, and so on. And first of all, I have to take some water. Sorry. So, and what I found was a remarkable difference between the way newsmakers and storytellers prepare their stories. The newsmaker, a common practice between the newsmaker was that of predefining. Actually, they often they initiate story angles or sometimes scenarios about stories, and then so before they gathered story material, before they speak to sources, they already had a clear, more or less clear idea in mind of what the story should be. And it was very difficult sometimes for reporters, if they had contradictory information from sources, to change the story angle. And maybe this sounds as not so really good journalism, but the practice of predefining has some important functionalities for these reporters. First of all, predefining ensures that you have a clear story at the end of the day. And when you, it works more efficiently to call someone with a clear story idea in mind than to call someone without knowing what your story will be. Then secondly, predefining ensures that you do not just disseminate the story of your source, that you have a clear story in mind as a journalist yourself. And third, predefining was often defended as a way to be distinctive in an online media landscape. Because very often a story angle was initiated by news chiefs, news managers, and those were the people who screened all similar stories in other media. And they knew that from that certain angle, they were sure that the story could have an added value in comparison with similar stories from other media. So that was the reasoning. So as illustrated by this citation from a Belgian editor-in-chief, so we want to send our journalists in a certain direction. We urgently need this with the emergence of online. Well, that's how she said it. The news as such has already been broken. The added value of a newspaper today, even an online newspaper, lies in its new and unique angles. So while predefining has some functionalities, there's also the threat that this may lead to a hypothesis confirming journalism, that journalists are becoming blind for alternative perspectives. And to go back to the case of Lance Armstrong, that he actually the idea that he could win the Tour de France was the dream scenario of the journalists back then in 1999. How unrealistic this scenario could be, it was the dream scenario. So when it happened like that, journalists were very happy, and they were not interested in alternative perspectives on the same event, which came out only many years later. Okay, then the storytellers. My expectation was that the practice of predefining would be even more important for the storytellers, because you have all those storytelling handbooks which emphasize that you need to have a scenario, a script, a baseline, an angle, a frame, before you start to do your research, before you start to speak with people, and so on. However, in practice, all those storytellers I interviewed, many of them were award-winning journalists, so it turned out that their stories, none of them were actually predefined. That the storyline of their stories, the scenario or angle or how you will call it, that it evolved only gradually in the news production process. Okay. And even more, storytellers, they say that good stories are just the result of luck, of reporters' luck. And that's not possible to have reporters' luck if you predefine stories. And this is illustrated by this reporter who said that if you are too prepared, you cannot be surprised anymore. You must leave as much as possible to chance. Do not board up your whole trip with appointments, then you are writing a premeditated story. While it is nicer to talk to people spontaneously, the moment you talk with them, there's a lot going on. You encounter very unexpected things, the craziest things. And another interesting thing about these storytellers was that while newsmakers are always talking about interviewing sources, these storytellers are talking about listening to people. So, in conclusion, if you look at how the stories are presented of these both groups as journalists, the stories of the newsmakers have probably more truthful outlook because they use conventional styles such as the inverted pyramids. But if you look at the news production process, at what is unseen for the audience, you could argue that the stories of the storytellers are actually more the result of a more open-minded, serendipitous search for truth or whatever, while the stories of the newsmakers are, well, more often the result of, finding what they are looking for. So that was it. I hope it made sense, and thank you for your attention.